Impact of Influence.
Covering true crime throughout the Southeast.
Hello, friend. Matt Harrison, Seton Tucker. Check out Impact of Influence on Facebook. And from there, you can find the YouTube channel. We are getting rolling. Also, we'd love it if you rate and share the episode. Give it 100 stars if that's possible, and comment on it. And of course, we'd love to hear your comments, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on cases we should cover. As you know, it's not going to be all Murdaugh all the time. Doing cases throughout the Southeast. We've done a few of those, and we're working on some other ones. We're getting lots of feedback and ideas.
Yes, lots of tips and cases that people would like us to cover. So we are looking into them. If we've not gotten back to you, please send us a reminder because we're getting so many.
We'll be on it. We're also looking to have guests that know about the case, whether it be attorneys, former law enforcement, etc. So what else do you have for us, Seton?
Well, we got some feedback from our last episode where we covered Alec Murdaugh's federal financial crime sentencing. And someone has told me they do not believe that Alec Murdaugh is going to be eligible for the First Step Act. He probably will only qualify for the 52 days a year of good time that you get basically as long as you just don't burn the jail down. But the First Step Act, you have to have a criminal history in a category 0. And right now, Alec Murdaugh has a 4. Now, also, another thing that would preclude you from participating in this First Step Act would be creating substantial financial harm to people, which has happened. So anyway, just some feedback on that.
And speaking of Alec Murdaugh, that's why we have our guest today, because Alec, as you know, failed the polygraph the feds gave him about the money crimes. And so we found a guest who has written a book about the history of the polygraph and lie detector. And let's bring him in now. Let's bring in our guest, Amit Katwala. He is a writer and editor for Wired, books, magazine features, podcasts, videos. You can see his TED Talks. You can find those on YouTube. And the book that we're talking about today that I got on Friday and blew through it in the weekend because it was so intriguing. Tremors in the Blood, Murder Obsession and the Birth of the Lie Detector. Thanks for joining us, Amit. I appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for having me.
Well, I wanted to just start off with a basic question. How did you become interested in this polygraph subject?
Well, you'll like this answer because it started out with an interest in true crime. I was watching Making a Murderer. I don't know if you remember that from a few years ago.
Yeah.
Stephen Avery and that case up in the north of America. And in the second season of that show, Stephen Avery goes through something called a brain fingerprinting test, where he goes under a brain scan, which is apparently designed to tell whether or not he's lying about the murders that he allegedly committed. And my background's in psychology and neuroscience, and watching this thing playing out on screen, I was like, this doesn't make any sense. This can't be true. So I did some digging, and I ended up writing a story for The Guardian about the kind of new science of lie detection. And as I was researching that story, what I found was a lot of parallels between the new science of lie detection, and I say science in sort of inverted commas here, and the kind of history of science or pseudoscience that was linked to the original lie detector, the polygraph machine. And so I kind of went down this rabbit hole, and I spent the next kind of couple of years basically digging into the history of the polygraph, finding all these problems with it, and then also these incredible sort of true crime stories that were like woven into the history of this machine. And this machine which had a massive influence on the justice system and continues to have a massive influence on the justice system, particularly in the States.
And I will tell you people, if you're true crime fans, this has many stories that he covers in depth about crimes that were committed or maybe not committed by the people that the lie detector was used against. And so you'll enjoy it, even if it's not from the historical perspective of how it all came together. But the lie detector, it's over 100 years old. And the two main people that started it was this police chief, Gus Volman, got together with a rookie officer, John Larson, eventually Leonard Keeler. Larson was a cop with a PhD, and explain how the Vollmer, the police chief, and John Larson got together, and their basic idea of what they were going to come up with, which would be called the polygraph.
Yeah, so basically, to take you back to the time the polygraph was invented, right? So policing in the kind of 1890s, early 20th century was a very unscientific profession, I can put it that way. So it was a lot of kind of family ties and people kind of getting, confessions beaten out of them with sticks and fists. And Vollmer was a veteran of the Spanish-American War, and he wanted to make policing a bit more humane, and he wanted to also make it a bit more scientific. He was based in Berkeley, California. And the resource that he had available to him being in Berkeley was a lot of kind of smart young college graduates. And he was basically the person who decided to kind of try and bring those sorts of people into policing, and then to try and bring in new technologies to help solve crime. So he brought in things like fingerprinting. He brought in things like radios so that officers could communicate. He brought in maps of crime so that you could identify hotspots. And then one of the other things he brought in was, he brought in this college cop, they were called. So there's this PhD student called John Larson, who was a criminologist who wanted to try and prevent crimes before they happened. And together they cooked up this idea to basically see whether they could use blood pressure to tell when someone was lying. And that was the sort of genus, the seed that became the polygraph machine.
Well, reading some of your articles, this situation at Berkeley, it sounded like it might be a terrible time to be a student there, because they really used this polygraph on the students to uncover lots of different crimes. I think it started out with some stolen jewelry. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, like I studied psychology, and even today, if you are a psychology student or a neuroscience student at undergraduate, you will get experimented on. It's just kind of part of the course.
True.
But yeah, so Larson and Vollmer built this machine. So it was kind of this very sort of ramshackle-looking machine. Someone in the papers at the time described it as sort of a mix between an alarm clock and a wireless radio and a sort of blood pressure cuff, and it looked very ugly. But anyway, they built this machine, and one of the first cases they used it on was this case of a series of thefts at a women's dorm in Berkeley at the university. And basically, a bunch of the women that staying at this dorm had their thing go missing, and the police were called. And eventually, the investigating officer sort of, I think, grew tired of interviewing dozens of women and kind of shoved the case over to Larson and was like, you deal with it with this new machine you've got. And so that was the first case the polygraph was used on. And actually, the first person that they used the polygraph on was a woman called Margaret Taylor, who was one of the victims of this crime. So I guess, as is normal in police interviewing, the first thing you do is interview the victim to try and narrow down the scope of your inquiries. And this is a bit of a side note, but Larson actually then ended up eventually marrying this woman. So that's sort of an early sign that maybe in a polygraph exam, the sort of power imbalance is not quite what it should be.
And he brought her back in and asked her if he loved her.
Or she loved him.
Yeah. And she actually lied.
Well, according to that test, yeah.
Yeah. It's quite an interesting story, actually. And it's sort of got this sort of almost like rom-com style meet cute sort of thing of him strapping her at a lie detector and saying, do you love me, and all this kind of stuff. But anyway, so they thought that they'd used the machine to kind of solve this crime, and they pinned the crime on a woman called Helen Graham, and she confessed and all seemed good. And then a few months later, she sort of tried to recant her confession. So even back then, there were these problems beginning to emerge, even with the first few cases the lie detector was actually used on.
And there's two big cases that you go into great detail and very interesting detail that show both sides of the polygraph in a way. And one of them, I guess the combination kind of broke some of the people that were involved with the beginning of the polygraph. One of those cases was Henry Wilkins in 1922. So it's only like a year after the invention of it. And I know that the case is, like I said, you cover it amazingly, but give us a synopsis of that and why that became a centerpiece of your story.
Yeah, so you're right. So it's May 1922. It's San Francisco, and Henry Wilkins is the mechanic. He's like a German immigrant, and he's driving back from a camping trip with his family. So he's got his wife in the car and his 2 kids, and they get pulled over by bandits, basically, and kind of held up at the roadside. And in the kind of struggle, his wife gets shot. And, he rushes to the hospital, but she passes away. And when the police come, he kind of says, there was these 3 guys, and they held us up. And then, when they tried to grab her jewelry, I reached for my own gun, and then they tried to shoot me, and she jumped across and saved me, but she got shot. So that was the kind of story that he told the police. And anyway, it kind of, over the next few weeks and months, that story sort of unravels, and it turns out that maybe Henry Wilkins was actually involved in his own wife's death. So, the police identified 2 suspects. Then in a police lineup, he claims that he never met the suspects. And then it transpires later in the week that actually he used to work with one of them. And then when they follow him after a meeting, they see him meeting these suspects or one of their brothers. So it's all it starts to not look very good for Henry. And that's when the polygraph gets called in. And the reason that I chose to focus on this case is, well, for a couple of reasons. First, because it's a bonkers case. Like I don't want to get into all the twists and turns of it, because we'll be here all day.
Yeah, you're right. There is a lot of turns. Yeah, if you had just done that, that would be a great book in itself.
And then the second reason was that this was it was one of the first times the polygraph had been used in a murder case, and it was one of the first significant cases where the polygraph sort of failed, I think. So it had been used in a couple of murder cases up until this point, and it sort of got, the right answer in inverted commas, in that what was found on the polygraph kind of matched up with what the jury found or what the police had found. Whereas here, what happened was that the evidence seemed to point overwhelmingly in terms of like Henry being guilty, but the polygraph actually found him innocent. And, he walked free, and though he did eventually go to trial, he was found innocent. And for John Larson, that was a real sort of blow, and it really changed the way that he thought about this machine he'd invented. He started to think of it as sort of a Frankenstein monster that he'd unleashed on the world, and he spent basically the rest of his life trying to undo the damage, trying to put this machine back in the box that he, inadvertently released it from.
Because, there are these, they're called countermeasures, where people have tried to find ways to beat the polygraph test, and it appears as if maybe in this case he did. What are those, and what are some of the ways that people have tried to beat polygraph tests?
Yeah, so the way a polygraph works is it looks for a difference between your response to control questions and your response to target questions. So a control question might be, is your name Henry? And a target question might be, did you kill her? Right? So the theory that it works on is that, if you're asked a question about the crime and you did the crime, then your pulse will go up, your blood pressure will go up, and those changes will be measurable, and you'll be able to spot them on the chart. So that's the theory. So countermeasures try and mess with that. So countermeasures might try and, for instance, exaggerate your response to the control questions, so that when the target questions come around, the difference isn't as big. So you can do that by clenching your muscles. So if you clench your butt while you're being asked a target question, a control question, then don't do that when you get asked a target question. Then the responses will look the same. So that's one thing. People have tried kind of pinching themselves or putting a pin in their shoe and then stepping on it when they get asked these control questions. So anything that's going to amp up your physical response to the control questions, so that when you get asked the target questions, the difference between the 2 responses isn't as big, can be used as a countermeasure.
And so you did a great story and great job in telling the story of the Wilkins case. And the other big one that you had a lot of focus on was one that really tore Larson apart later in life, and that was the case of Rappaport.
That's right.
And that was the opposite of the other one, where Henry Wilkins was guilty and Rappaport probably was innocent. Explain that case in a nutshell.
Yeah, and I'm not even sure. To be honest, I'm not sure whether he was innocent or not.
Yeah, that's true.
So the second case, in Chicago, this is in Chicago, so it's 11 years later, kind of mid-1930s in Chicago, and Joe Rappaport is, he gets basically accused of killing this guy called Max Dent. So Max Dent was sort of a kind of drug pusher and sort of low-level police informant, basically, and then Joe Rappaport gets accused of killing him because the motive was supposedly that Max Dent was about to testify against him.
Right.
And he goes to trial, gets found guilty, gets given the death penalty, and by this point, Leonard Keeler, who we've not talked about yet, so Leonard Keeler was sort of John Larson's protege, and he was this kind of high school kid when they met, and he's the one who really was responsible for like popularizing the lie detector and spreading it across America.
He was trying to make some money off of it. He was trying to make it a moneymaker.
Sorry. So he was the one who was kind of trying to turn it into a commercial project, I guess, trying to make money out of it effectively, whereas Larson was more about the pure science. Keeler was the showman, the salesman. And so by the mid-1930s, Keeler was living in Chicago. Larson had been in Chicago, but then had to leave in disgrace for a bunch of slightly lurid reasons that I get into in the book. And basically what happened was that Rappaport was on death row, and the governor of Illinois, Henry Horner, kept giving him stays of execution. He was being pressurized by Rappaport's family and the community to not execute him. So he kept giving him stays of execution. And after, I think, 3 or 4 of these, he eventually said, right, okay, if this guy can pass a lie detector test that says he's innocent, I'll commute the sentence. I'll let him live. So Keeler kind of goes along to the jail with the polygraph equipment, straps Rappaport in. He fails the test and, is executed shortly afterwards. And the challenge here is not so much whether or not he was guilty. It's more like, he was found, this machine, this unreliable machine was basically used to decide whether or not a man lived or died. And that is like hugely problematic.
And it was, correct me if I'm wrong, didn't Keeler, like when he did the test, he was not even doing it the way you were supposed to do it. Like he was breaking all the rules.
Right.
We should talk about the reliability.
If you look at, and I think the media kind of does things a bit of a disservice, and I understand why, because if you actually were to sit and watch a lie detector test being done in real time, the way it should be done, it's very, very boring and very, very long, because you're meant to ask each question several times. You're meant to wait like a minute between each question to let the bodily response settle down. It takes ages. This is like a 4, 5, 6 hour thing. It's a real marathon. Whereas obviously on TV, it's sort of like, people get strapped in and then, 10 minutes later they're, getting marched out again with a piece of paper saying, they were lying, whatever. And, but above all, it's meant to be in a sort of, neutral setting. And, death row is not a neutral setting. And while Rappaport was being put on the machine, the lights in the cell that he was in were flickering because they were testing the electric chair in the next room.
Jeez.
Oh my goodness. That sounds like a calm environment there.
Yeah, really.
Well, you just mentioned the media, and, we see these, true crime TV shows, Law and Order, and someone gets a lie detector test and they fail. And we also see headlines here in the States that someone, passed or failed a polygraph test, and you kind of get this assumption of guilt or innocence based on whether someone has passed this, but the reliability is not as black and white as what you're led to believe in the media.
Yeah, that's right. And if you look at kind of the scientific work that's been done on the accuracy of the lie detector, it can be as low as 40% sometimes. It ranges between 40% and 70%. It varies wildly depending on who's actually conducting the test. And it's presented as this sort of scientific machine that's giving you like unbiased results. But really, it's a lot of it's about interpretation. A lot of it's about who's doing the test and who's being tested. There's a huge amount of bias in the process as well. Ultimately, it's akin to reading tea leaves or doing a palm reading or something like that, right? Like it's operating at that level. And I have to be quite careful when I talk about this, because obviously, like, it can be useful, and it can be, it has obviously helped, bring people to justice. But I think when it is useful, it's often as a sort of like psychological prop in a way. It's sort of the illusion of science, right? Someone I speak to about this, an academic, calls it sort of zombie forensics, right? This, akin to security theatre at airports. It's there to make the subject feel like they're under interrogation by a machine that's going to rat them out if they don't tell the truth.
Well, as a matter of fact, you talk about, I don't know if it was Chicago police or somebody was using like a copier or something, right? And just telling the criminal to put the hand in the copier and it would shoot out if they were telling the truth.
Yeah, that's right. So that's actually in David Simon's book, his nonfiction book, and then he recreates that scene in The Wire. So yeah, exactly. But I think originally it was in Detroit, and then
Detroit,
obviously in The
that's
Wire
right.
it's in Baltimore. But yeah, they used to get the suspects to put their hand on a Xerox machine, and then they would just get the machine to print out a piece of paper with "he's lying" written on it, and that would be enough to sort of convince them that they just had to tell the truth.
So
It's,
it's
it's
been
sort of about the psychological pressure that the machine, or even the idea of a machine, can put on people.
well, the guys who invented it, were ended up being against it, and they even called it, I believe, a psychological form of torture, which they were hoping to get away from by having this device, and yet it's been 100 years of this, and it's basically, is it basically still the same thing it's measuring that it was in 1921?
Essentially, yeah. So the only difference is that back then you would have had physical pens. So all the equipment, the blood pressure cuff, and the cables that wrapped around your chest would be connected to physical pens, and your movement would translate into the movement of the pens. Whereas now it's more likely to be connected to kind of a computer, and the lines will be not on a piece of paper but on the chart. And but everything else is basically the same. They've added kind of a sweat response. So sometimes you'll see on TV, like people will have something attached to their finger that's measuring their galvanic sweat response. So that's just another kind of another source of information. But even now, a lot of the interpretation is still sort of done by eye, by feel. There's no sort of objective way of doing it. There were efforts to create objective, unbiased polygraph scoring algorithms in the 80s, but polygraph examiners didn't really want them. And I think they kind of, that's a kind of tacit admission that what they do is more art than science, right? It's more about interrogation and interpersonal skills, I guess, than it is about the science of the machine.
So one thing that polygraphs can be used for is as an investigative technique, but we often see these as part of deals. If you're going to make a deal with the federal government or that sort of thing, it's a requirement to take and pass a polygraph test. How do you see these two different types of ways of using a polygraph important?
Yeah, so there's something similar that's been happening in the UK recently as well, where it's being increasingly used to assess people who are on probation for, sex offences or for terrorism offences. It's being used. And look, I think that it can be useful in those cases, but I think it needs to be used with eyes open about, the reliability and the accuracy of it. And actually, I think in the case that you guys have been following on this podcast, I actually don't mind it being used in that scenario because it's fairly low stakes in the sense that, the guy's already in prison and this is about, assessing whether or not it's about trying to extract more information from him, right? And, if you can't get that information from him, then, okay, the stakes are relatively low in terms of no one's going to die as a result or that kind of thing. Whereas the problem I have with it is that, if you put too much weight on these tools and you end up letting guilty people walk free, then that can lead to really severe consequences. There was a serial killer in the Pacific Northwest in I think the 70s and 80s, maybe 90s actually, called Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer he was called. And he, killed a bunch of women, was brought in, was polygraph tested, passed the polygraph test, was let go and went on to kill loads more people. And that's really problematic when the machine gets the wrong result. And because it's a machine and we kind of, believe in science and we trust machines more than we trust ourselves, it sort of leads to these, wrong outcomes.
I think the number is somewhere around 200 people that we know of unjustly imprisoned in, I think, just England alone due to failed polygraphs. Is those numbers close?
Yeah, so that's actually, I think that figure's from the United States actually, but
the States, okay.
Yeah, there are loads of cases. If you look at kind of the Innocence Project and things like that, there are several documented cases of people being coerced into confessing on polygraphs, and then actually it turns out later on that they were telling the truth. And like you say, those kind of, it's really hard to tell whether someone's pulse is racing because they're lying or because they're nervous, right? If you're afraid of being wrongly accused, you know, how are you supposed to determine whether someone's stressed because they're afraid of being wrongly accused or because they're afraid of being found out, right? It's really, really difficult for a
they just may be a
to
sweaty person.
figure that out.
Just a person that sweats a lot has a problem with the
Yeah, exactly. Or someone who's nervous for other reasons, right? You know, and I think being interrogated about a murder is probably a pretty nervous situation to be in, regardless of whether you did it or not.
Well, is there any sort of standard? You've mentioned it's scientific, but it's slightly an art form. Do polygraph examiners go through any sort of training? Is there any sort of standard? Because it seems to me that there could be some polygraph examiners who are better than others.
Yeah, so there is a organization called the American Polygraph Association. However, it's not compulsory. So, you know, there's nothing to stop you from going out, buying a polygraph, starting to test people. You can become a polygraph examiner, a licensed polygraph examiner. I think it takes 12 weeks, I think the course is.
Oh, that's it?
Yeah, it's really, really quite straightforward. And, you know, you can basically go from, you know, being someone with no interrogation experience to being, you know, a licensed, qualified polygraph examiner in less than a year. And
oh, wow.
It just blows my mind that all these studies and all these facts show that it's pseudoscience. And I wonder if the people who tout it really believe it, or do they have some sort of other motive? I mean, do they really convince themselves that they know a liar? I guess we don't know.
That there's probably two things happening. I think there's probably at the coalface, I think people probably do believe that it works. And you know, I think they probably do believe that they're getting the right results. And I think, to be honest, like a lot of the time they probably are. It's just the problem is that these like edge cases, right? These, you know, if you're going to use technology to, you know, sentence someone to death or send them to prison for the rest of their life, then you really, really need to be sure that it's like 100% accurate. So I think that's part of it. And then I think the other reason that it proliferates is because it's convenient, right? It's much more convenient for a police department to get a confession out of someone on a polygraph machine than it is to take them to trial. It's much more expensive to take them to trial than it is to, you know, sit them in a room with an examiner for 2 hours and come out with a confession.
Right. The book is fantastic. Tremors in the Blood, Murder Obsession, and the Birth of the Lie Detector. Amit, thank you very much for spending time with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
All right. We are wrapping this one up. Please rate and share the episode. Check out the YouTube channel. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, I should say. And check out the Facebook page of Impact of Influence. Are you good, Seton? Are you good?
I'm good.
You want me to hook you up to a lie detector and ask you some questions?
I honestly think that I would fail a lie detector test. And I think I could pass the questions like, you know, do you...
Your name?
Right. Or, you know, yes, what's your name? You know, do you like dogs? That sort of thing I think I could pass. But you automatically ask someone, are you guilty of killing your neighbor? Just saying that makes my heart race.
Well, I think of it in a smaller case when I was married. Or if you're married and you walk in, right? And they like say like, where have you been? Sometimes you feel like a guilty for a second.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
Even though you didn't do anything, weren't anywhere. You're like, what? Was I? Did I?
Did I?
Or when I go through the airport, go to the metal detector, sometimes I'm like, did I accidentally hide something in my pockets?
I know. Like, do I have my bag?
Is there something in my behind? I don't know. Well, that's a little much. All right. Well, there you go. We will talk soon, friend.